Spiritualism really did kind of burst in on the scene in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1840s. And it started with a pair of sisters in New York State, the Fox sisters.
Margaret and Kate Fox were two little girls when spiritualism started, and they lived in Hydesville, New York. And in their presence, they started hearing noises, rapping sounds.
And they were just little schoolgirls. I mean, they were just naughty little girls. And it was, I think, October. And it was the winter was coming on, and evenings are very long, and it must have been very boring. And they found that they could crack their toe joints.
And eventually they discovered that they could make a code, as in 1 rap for yes, 2 raps for no.
People obviously wanted to know, if they weren't making the noises, who was and who was doing it. So they made up a story. They said that it was a man who'd lived in the house before and who'd died. He'd been murdered. You know, here was the dead coming back.
The classic story is that little Kate Fox was sitting in the room, and she went, and immediately, and then she went without making a sound, and then, and she said to her mother, "Mother, it can see as well as hear." Now, her mother was a nice Methodist woman, and she was freaked out.
And the word spread. And before anybody knew what was happening, here were these two naughty little girls had become a sort of cult.
The spiritualists were so determined to believe in the supernatural that 40 years later, when Margaret Fox made a full confession, admitting she had faked everything, some still refused to accept it.
It was the kind of thing that, you know, myths and fairy stories are all built on. And they'd started their own myth. And it was impossible to put a lid on it after that, because people so much wanted to communicate with the dead, because everybody knows somebody that's died. And everybody would like to be able, perhaps, to get in touch with them.
Whether it was real or not, it launched a huge movement of spiritualism.
Because there was no television, one of the most popular form of entertainments was seances. Every town had 20, 30 spiritualists.
You'd be seated around a table. Often people would hold hands or place their fingers on top of the table. There would be a medium present.
The room was then darkened.
And in a situation like that, there's all sorts of room for shenanigans going on.
You had bells. You had stringed instruments. You had strange voices. You had people touching you in different places. There were sort of telescopic rods that were developed for mediums, which had a sort of glove on the end of it or something of this sort, so you could sort of whiz out your rod and tap somebody at the other side of the table. Spiritualist mediums developed a very convenient item called the cabinet, where you retreated in order to have your trance and get your manifestations. Well, it was tremendously useful, because what the cabinet was what it sounds like. It was a curtained off or cupboarded off bit of the room where you went inside and you couldn't be seen, and you could wriggle out of your bonds and produce phenomena.
I will now ask the young men to leave the cabinet and draw the curtains while they enter the usual trance. I am now going into a deep, deep trance. I feel the souls of the departed all about me. Darkness, please.
As the craze for seances swept the Western world, magicians soon worked out the tricks that were being used by spirit mediums, especially the spirit cabinet. They were quick to cash in.
The Davenport brothers were the ones who took it into a showbiz situation. The Davenport brothers were two young Americans who, in the mid-1850s, created what's called the Spirit Cabinet Act.
The Davenport brothers had a wooden cabinet, a bit like a large wardrobe,
inside of which there were implements and also chairs, and the Davenport brothers would sit in the chairs and have their hands tied behind their backs.
and the doors were closed. And almost immediately, tambourines which were placed inside the cabinet would ring, bells would ring.
Guitars would play and things would fly in and out.
Trumpets were endlessly used because in the dark the voices would come through the trumpet.
And when the doors were opened, the boys were apparently still tied up. So it was said that in the darkness of the cabinet, the spirits could operate freely. Once the light came in, the spirits had to go.
It was kind of a cross between a magic show and spiritualism. The apparatus was spiritualist. The tricks were spiritualist. I mean, it was manifestations like spiritualists did, but in a way it wasn't very religious. It was kind of an in-between.
Now, the Davenport brothers never, as far as I understand, never overtly claimed to be spiritualists. Their manager might have claimed it for them, but their performance was just strictly a performance where they personally made no claims whatever.
In a way, this kind of crossover they had wasn't very satisfactory psychologically for the audience. And so they got exposed in a welter of shame and thrown guitars.
Stage magicians were in no doubt that it was the brothers and not the spirits who were throwing guitars around inside their cabinet. But whilst they denounced the Davenports as fakes, they also pinched their tricks.
Houdini's relationship to the whole spiritualist phenomenon was very, very complex. For a start, at the early part of his career, he himself had done spiritualist and mind-reading acts with his wife Bess. So he knew the tricks, and he understood how all this was done.
In fact, it was the Davenports who inspired Houdini's earliest rope escape tricks, which launched his phenomenal success.
In the case of Houdini, he was desperate to believe. He tremendously wanted to believe you could communicate with the dead, because he was completely mother-fixated, and after his mother had died, all he wanted was to get back in touch with her. But he was constantly frustrated because the mediums who promised to put him in touch with her were, to the eyes of Houdini, a magician, it was perfectly clear what they were doing. They were doing tricks, and so he was furious beyond measure, because he could see that what they were doing was preying on people and making a mockery of deep desires.
So Houdini incorporated the public humiliation of spirit mediums into his act, exposing them on stage and in the press. Like many magicians, he despised their hypocrisy, but exploiting their methods was also lucrative.
There is a genuine feeling that the methods of the magician are being put to a terrible use here. To cheat people, to deceive them in the bad sense, and to give them false hopes. And on the other hand, spiritualist busting is good business.
Such good business that even early filmmakers could still see the entertainment value in it. This silent film was made 70 years after the Fox sisters had first played their rapping games.
And now to show you how the ghost or ectoplasm was produced.
And later still, Joseph Dunninger, a great American mentalist of the 1930s, was still getting mileage out of exposing spiritualist tricks.
It is a simple matter for the medium in the dark to attach this so-called spirit to the end of his reaching rod and then float it over the heads of his audience.
But by then, spiritualist tricks had become a standard element of the mentalist stage routine.
Thanks to this false hand, the rest speaks for itself.
This was thanks to the brilliant theatrical instincts of a remarkable stage performer, Anna Eva Faye.
People commented upon her gorgeous honey-coloured hair that shone in the footlights.
She was an incredible megastar, and people sat and almost worshipped her.
When she teamed up with her husband, they basically created a double act that they called the indescribable phenomenon.
She had begun on stage as a mixture of mentalism and magics. She featured